The morning air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, each breath drawing in the cold tang of New Mexico's high desert in winter. Eli Carter rode his bay mare along the fence line of the north pasture, the slow rhythm of hooves on frozen soil blending with the faint whistle of the wind. At 52, his face was weathered by sun and dust, his hands shaped by years of ranch work and the harder years before that, years of war, of killing, of watching men fall and learning to live with it. Mornings like this were usually quiet. But today, the quiet felt wrong. The land stretched wide and bare under a pale sky, the kind of openness that made a man feel small and exposed. Eli kept scanning the horizon out of habit. Out here, trouble didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it came slow, like a gathering storm, and sometimes it was just there waiting. That was when he saw it, a dark, unnatural shape breaking the clean lines of grass and snow near the bend in the creek. It swayed gently, like something caught in the wind, but not the way a branch or a hanging tarp would move. He rode closer, the mare's ears twitching uneasily. The shape grew clear, thin legs dangling, hair drifting across a small, pale face. His gut tightened. A young girl hung from a thick limb of the old cottonwood that grew by the creek. Her bare feet hovered just above the hard ground, toes stiff and bloodless. A rope bit into her neck, the fibers frayed but taut. Resting against her chest was a rough slab of wood, edges blackened, with deep, uneven letters carved into it, "White man don't forgive." Eli stopped the mare 20 feet away, letting his eyes sweep the surrounding land. The cottonwood stood near a slow bend where the creek ran shallow. The grass was thin there, broken by patches of exposed earth. It was a good place for an ambush, and his years in the cavalry had taught him to trust his instincts. The breeze was light, carrying no scent of smoke or horses, but still he kept his hand near the rifle slung across the saddle horn. The stillness felt unnatural, heavy. He dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. Up close, the girl couldn't have been more than 15 or 16. Her dress, patterned in the colors of the Apache, was torn at the seams, stained with dust and blood. She was small, too small to belong in a scene like this, a body hung like a message. He had seen enough death to know when it was fresh. The way her limbs still swayed told him it hadn't been long. That thought made his jaw clench. Whoever had done this might still be close. Pulling the knife from his belt, he stepped forward, cutting the rope with a single, quick motion. Her body sagged into his arms, lighter than he expected. Her skin was cold, her head lolling against his shoulder, and for a moment he was sure he was too late. He laid her down gently in the grass, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Then, against all expectation, her eyelids fluttered. Her breathing was shallow, the rise and fall of her chest barely noticeable. Eli tilted his canteen, letting a drop of water touch her cracked lips. She swallowed weakly, then opened her eyes. They were dark and unfocused, but they fixed on him for a brief moment before darting toward the tree line. "The broken bar coming back," she whispered, her voice rough and dry. The words were like a spark on dry tinder in his mind. Coming back. That meant they hadn't gone far. He didn't ask questions. There wasn't time. His eyes swept the ground, reading the signs left in the dirt. Hoofprints of 4, maybe 5 horses cut deep into the mud near the creek's edge. The edges were still sharp, not yet softened by wind or sun. Beside them lay a crushed cigarette butt, the ash still warm between his fingers. They had been here less than an hour ago. If they were doubling back, they might already be circling. Eli lifted her again, feeling the awkward looseness of her limbs. She was light as dry twigs, her head resting against his chest. His mare shifted uneasily as he mounted, sensing the tension in him. He settled the girl in front of him, one arm bracing her against the jostle of the ride while the other gripped the reins. With a sharp nudge of his heels, the mare broke into a brisk trot, hooves striking against the frozen ground with steady urgency. The plain stretched open in every direction, leaving him exposed. Every few minutes he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see riders emerging from the line of distant cottonwoods, rifles gleaming in the sun. But the horizon remained empty, the only sound the steady thud of hooves and the shallow, uneven breaths of the girl in his arms. He kept his mind on the trail ahead and the weight of the sign's message pressing against the back of his thoughts. He had heard such warnings before. Out here, grudges were carved deeper than fence posts, and revenge was often quicker than the law. The ride back to the ranch seemed longer than usual. The girl stirred weakly now and again, a faint sound slipping from her lips, but her eyes stayed closed. The cold wind bit at Eli's face, and he urged the mare faster. His cabin came into view, a squat, weathered structure of pine and cedar that had stood against a dozen winters. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, and the sight gave him a flicker of relief. He dismounted without setting her down, pushing the cabin door open with his shoulder. Inside, the single room was warm from the fire, the scent of wood smoke lingering in the air. He laid her gently on the bed in the corner, pulling a wool blanket over her small frame. Her skin burned with fever now, a heat that told him the cold outside had been the least of her problems. He set a kettle of water to boil on the stove and began pulling supplies from the shelf: clean cloths, a small jar of salve, dried herbs his mother had once claimed could pull sickness from a man's bones. As he worked, his gaze kept drifting to the window. The land outside lay quiet under the pale sun, but quiet didn't mean safe. Men who strung a girl up as a message wouldn't take kindly to anyone undoing their work. If she was right, if they were coming back, it was only a matter of time before he saw dust on the horizon. His hand lingered on the stock of his rifle, propped by the door. He returned to the bed, dampening a cloth and pressing it lightly to her forehead. Her breathing was steadier now, though her eyes stayed shut. He spoke softly, telling her she was safe for now, though he knew better than to promise more than that. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest sound, and maybe the groan of the barn door in the breeze, or maybe the far-off echo of hoofbeats. Eli's jaw tightened. Whatever it was, he would be ready when it reached his door. The kettle hissed softly, steam curling toward the low ceiling, but Eli barely heard it over the rush of his own thoughts. The girl lay still, the flicker of the firelight casting shadows over her bruised face. Her breathing was steadier now, but she was far from out of danger. He pulled the kettle from the stove, pouring the hot water over dried willow bark in a chipped mug. His mother's remedy might help ease her fever, though he suspected her wounds went deeper than what herbs could reach. Outside, the wind rattled the cabin walls like a warning. He crossed to the window and peered out at the open land. The late afternoon light had shifted, turning the grass a dull gold, shadows stretching long across the ground. A man could see trouble coming from miles away out here, but that didn't make it easier to face. Far to the west, a faint smudge rose against the horizon. It could have been the dust of a small herd moving, or it could have been riders. Eli's gut told him the latter. The girl's warning echoed in his mind: they're coming back. He moved to the rifle, leaning against the wall, checking the chamber and the clean oil sheen along the barrel. There was food enough to last a few days if they had to stay inside, but a cabin was a poor place to make a stand. If the men who'd left her at the tree came in numbers, he'd be boxed in before he could blink. Still, running wasn't an option, and not with her too weak to ride on her own. He set the rifle by the door and started laying out ammunition on the table. The girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around as though unsure where she was, then winced when she tried to sit up. Eli was at her side before she could speak, pressing a steadying hand to her shoulder. "Easy now," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're safe here." Her gaze locked on his, wary but searching, as though trying to decide if she believed him. After a moment, she whispered her name Anaya. The word was barely audible, but it rooted itself in his mind. She didn't say much more at first, sipping the bitter tea he helped her drink. When she did speak, her words came in slow fragments. "There had been 5 of the white men," she said, though she spat the word like it burned her mouth. "They'd ridden into her village 2 nights ago." She didn't know what they wanted at first, only that they carried rifles and whiskey. By morning, half the huts were burned, and 3 people were dead. She'd been taken, tied, beaten when she fought back. Then they'd left her hanging with that sign, as if daring someone to care. Eli listened in silence, his jaw tightening with each word. He'd seen men like that before, hard, mean types who thought their cruelty was just another right the land owed them. Once, he might have been ordered to track them down in uniform. Now, the law out here was scattered, slow, and sometimes just as mean as the men it was meant to stop. He knew one thing: if the riders on the horizon were the same men, they weren't coming to talk. He'd have to decide soon whether to meet them head-on or vanish into the hills. By nightfall, the smudge on the horizon had grown into a definite shape. 3 riders this time, not 5, but the way they moved told Eli they were hunting. They kept a deliberate pace, scanning the land as they drew closer. He banked the fire low, keeping the cabin's light to a faint glow. Naya sat up against the wall, clutching the blanket around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the darkening window. "They will not stop," she said quietly, the certainty in her tone sharper than fear. Eli believed her. The riders stopped 100 yards from the cabin, their silhouettes barely visible in the fading light. One of them shouted something Eli couldn't make out, the words carried away by the wind. Another laugh followed, mean and mocking. He could almost see their grins from here. They didn't dismount, just turned their horses in a slow circle, watching. Eli kept the rifle in his hands, resting the barrel on the window frame, though he didn't fire. Men like that wanted to draw you out first. He wasn't going to give them the pleasure. For nearly an hour they lingered, the air thick with the threat of violence. At last, they wheeled their horses and rode back toward the west, vanishing into the dark. Eli knew better than to think it was over. They'd be back, maybe with the others, maybe in the dead of night. He barred the door, set more rounds on the table, and sat down opposite Naya. She didn't ask what he was planning. Maybe she could see the decision in his eyes, the way old soldiers carried a certain weight before a fight. Sleep came in fragments that night. Eli dozed in the chair by the door, waking at every creak of the cabin or snap of frost outside. Before dawn, he stepped out into the cold, the horizon still painted with the faintest gray of morning. Tracks in the dirt told him the riders had come back in the night, circling the cabin before leaving again. They were testing him, letting him know he was marked. He ground out his cigarette in the snow and went back inside, his mind set. He spent the morning readying the place, moving the table against the door, setting a second rifle by the back window, checking the revolver on his hip. Naya watched him without speaking, her eyes sharp now despite the fever's lingering hold. By mid-morning, the sound came again, hoofbeats, faint but building. He counted the 4 this time. When the first rider crested the rise, rifle slung casually across his saddle, Eli felt the calm settle over him, the one that always came just before the shooting started. He stepped to the window, sighted down the barrel, and waited.